New York City has over 47,000 vacant land parcels, totaling thousands of acres. Now, for decades, these have been considered liabilities to be fenced off and avoided. What a waste. Where's the vision in that? Mark Twain said, "You cannot depend on your eyes when your imagination is out of focus." I prefer Agatha Christie's outlook better. You all know Agatha Christie, the great mystery writer. You see, she was married to one of the preeminent archaeologists of her time. Once, when she was asked, "What's it like to be married to an archaeologist?" she replied, "Oh, it's wonderful. The older I get, the more interested in me he becomes." Now, she was clever enough to see her age as an asset rather than a liability. And we need to be clever enough to recognize that New York City, with its 47,000 abandoned lots, has an amazing asset just waiting to be deployed. If only we can use the tools, the concepts of green infrastructure. Now, this brings up a central point in our efforts to reconnect children with nature. As we become more of an urban nation, and as the demographics of our country continue to change, reconnecting children with nature will be less about bringing the kids to nature and more about bringing nature to the kids. Taking an inner-city child from Washington, D.C. to Yellowstone is a bit like sending her to the moon for a week. It simply is too big a leap. We need to bring nature to these kids in a way that makes sense to them. And then later, after they have developed a connection, a love for nature, then we can make our way to Yellowstone. By the year 2050, 85% of all Americans will live in cities. If we are to make nature relevant to these Americans, then we must recognize the value not only of our national forests and wildlife refuges, but also of our neighborhood parks, our wooded cul-de-sacs and abandoned lots that have yet to be restored. For too long, we in the environmental movement have defined nature in terms of wildness, far away and pristine. And as a result, nature has become a foreign country that we get to visit only once in a while. That will never do. Nature must be nearby. It must be accessible. It must be returned to our daycare centers, our schools, and our communities. Green infrastructure all around us. We need to rethink our priorities and remake our culture. Restoring our connection to our natural world is no little plan, but we have little time to waste. Consider this. There are 20 million diabetics in this country today. There will be 40 million in 2015. And if we don't change course, 80 million in the year 2050. Already we spend nearly $2 trillion each year on health care, with 95% of that spent on direct medical service and only 5% allocated to preventing disease and promoting health and a healthy lifestyle. The implications for the country are severe, from a health perspective to the impact on local, state, and national budgets, to corporate competitiveness, to the future of our magnificent land and water legacy. We need to rethink our approach to wellness and health, nature as the first prescription rather than the last. We know that patients in rooms with tree views have shorter hospitalizations, and that children with ADHD who have access to natural areas are calmer and require less medication. And we know that the presence of trees outside apartment buildings in a public housing project in inner-city Chicago predicted better coping skills, less crime, and less violence. And finally, we know that among children who play in paved-over playgrounds, the leaders tend to be the most physically mature, while among children who play on green playgrounds, the children tend to be the most creative. Remember, these are the future leaders of our country. With all the complexity in the world today, from global warming to free trade and immigration to ethnic and religious intolerance, do we really believe that we can lead based on strength alone? All Americans care about these issues. They may come to the table for different reasons, but they want a seat at the table. And we need to set a place for them. Poor people, people of color, people with disabilities, and others who have the least access to natural settings and who may need it the most. As a nation, we will be paid back many times over. My favorite lapel button says simply, "The meek are getting ready." Now, I'm not sure if the meek will inherit the earth, but I am sure that young people will, and you need to help them get ready. Now, I'd like to leave you with a few final thoughts. As I travel across all 50 states of this great country, too often I witness a culture of confrontation rather than collaboration. Too often I am reminded of John Gardner's phrase, "the war of the parts against the whole." The war of the parts against the whole. Over fears of liability, we post no running signs in county parks. Over fears that our children may encounter a sociopath, we encourage sedentary, antisocial behavior by allowing our kids to spend hours in front of an electronic screen. And over fears of nature itself, we quarantine kids under virtual house arrest, thereby ensuring that they too will fear the very thing that they need the most. For tens of thousands of years, kids went outside and played in nature, and we are reversing that in a matter of decades. The area beyond which children are free to roam has shrunk by 89% in the last 20 years. It simply doesn't add up. We need a children's Bill of Rights that is explicit about the freedom to explore and improvise, about the right to experience nature in a meaningful way. If the world of our future, with all its complexity, will demand people who are able to understand and adapt, who have creativity and compassion, can we afford anything less? In our own Declaration of Independence, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With all that we know about the benefits of nature to children's health, the importance of green infrastructure, to cognitive ability and socialization, shouldn't access to nature be an unalienable right? Christopher Reeve, the actor, he had a terrible accident and was paralyzed. And he had on the wall of his room when he was in rehab a picture of the space shuttle blasting off. And it was autographed by every astronaut who was then at NASA. On top of the picture it said, "We found nothing is impossible." Nothing is impossible. And Reeve said, that should be our motto. Not a Democratic motto, not a Republican motto, but an American motto, because it's not something one party can do alone. It's something we as a nation must do together. You see, so many of our dreams at first seem impossible, then they seem improbable, and then when we summon the will, they soon become inevitable. Whole and healthy children, vibrant communities, and vast intact landscapes. It is time we began to speak of these things as if they are not only possible, but inevitable. Now, if you listen to the rhetoric on Capitol Hill, on TV and on the radio, and in state houses all across America, all you hear about today is the decline of the nation. Well, frankly, I don't buy it. Increasingly, I find myself in camp with former Secretary of State George Shultz. He was asked if he thought we should be optimistic about our country's fortunes and future. Absolutely, he said. There is every reason to have confidence. He then told the story of Sumner Sleeter, an economics professor at Harvard, 50 years ago. He was not the most admired man in his department, but he'd make pronouncements about the economy that turned out to be right more often than his colleagues. After Selzer died, a friend was asked to clean out his desk and found the start of an autobiography. It said, "I have had a good record in my comments on and expectations of the American economy, and the reason is I've always been an optimist. How did I get that way? I was brought up in the West, where the future is more important than the past, in a family of scientists and engineers, forever developing new things. I could never buy into the idea that we had crossed our last frontier, because I was brought up with people crossing new frontiers." Green infrastructure is the new frontier. At this time, when political and economic upheaval has all of us searching for a path forward, green infrastructure holds the key. It is about investing in community in the broadest sense of the word, about building things up, not knocking them down, about knitting back together the very fabric of which this country was made. We need your leadership now more than ever. And so as I end and pass the podium back to Chris, I want to thank you all for being here this morning. I want to thank you for all the work that you have done, and more importantly, for all the work that I know you will continue to do. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.